Welcome to GoatRanch. Wanted to show you guys my gear. In my camera bag, I have a pouch for everything, my blower, battery, ND filter, all that jazz. And I have all this. I'm not using my ND filter because I'm inside of my ISO 3200 as it is, which looking pretty clean at ISO 3200, not gonna lie. I love that shallow depth of field. I'm sorry, getting carried away here. I have all my lenses here. 75-300 telephoto, standard 18-55. My first lens for this camera was actually really the first video that I've only released that was filmed on this camera was using this lens. But right now I have the 24mm f2.8 lens on there, just because I wouldn't be able to do this with the 18-55. I would not even. Plus that f2.8. So if I were to have this on my other lens, with the current settings, it would look like this. Reasonably shallow depth of field. Actually, technically at 24mm, it would look like this. So pretty dark. I'd have to bump it up to 3200. But we all like that shallow depth of field, so set it back to 2.8. Has a rain cover in there. Not the greatest. I have my Rode video mic. I have a spare battery for extra long lasting filming sessions. I have my miniature tripod, my lens brush. Of course I have the blowy thingy, whatever that's called, and I have lens spray with a lens wipe. I have my battery charger just for travel purposes. I have a camera rain cover right there. Of course the rocket blower. Right, I have an extra 64GB SD card in here, which is useful. I have 64 gigs of space right there. Well, I'm hoping to get this thing, it's January 1st right now. Happy New Year. Hoping to get this video published, ideally today. We'll see how that goes. You've seen my ND filter. I don't know. No, you haven't seen my ND filter, have you? Right. Because I've been very neglectful about my uploading practices. So it's a 1 to 9 stop variable ND. Right now it's at the minimum setting. And if I turn it, it gets darker. That's for fine-tuning my exposure, which is very useful. And the reason you would want an ND filter, not just crank up your shutter, is, let's just say I'm in broad daylight, right? And everything is just super hot, overexposed. Oh my gosh. See, I have two options. I could start cranking up the shutter speed, like that. So now everything looks all jittery and not good. Or I could put on my ND filter and dial that back in, and then I can open up my aperture like this. Or alternatively, I'll dial down my aperture to about there, right? So that's pretty good. So now I've lost my shallow depth of field. You can pretty much see everything behind me. Now that doesn't look very cinematic, does it? But I want to put on my ND filter, and now everything's super dark. Now I am just using my ISO, so things are getting a little bit grainy, but I know this is just a placeholder because I'm not going to thread on and off my ND filter. Plus there's no reason. So now I put on my ND filter, and I follow the 180-degree shutter rule, which means I get very natural looking motion blur with my hands, and I get that nice shallow depth of field that looks so cinematic. I'll throw in a before and after shot so you can see what overcranking the shutter is, narrowing down the aperture, and putting on a simulated ND filter. In this case, I just lowered my ISO back down. So that's the effect, that's the reason you would want an ND filter. Excellent tool for cinematographers, and I really want to get good at my video skills, and also for vlogging. You know, I kind of want to have that extra cinematic feel, so I can add the 180-degree shutter rule, in this case 1/50th of a second, because I'm filming this at 24 frames a second. Ideally it'd be 1/48th, but 1/50th is fine. So I can follow that 180-degree shutter rule and keep my wide open aperture, because you dial in ISO 100, f2.8, 1/50th of a second, or even with my B-roll lens, the 50mm f1.8, and you're going to be way overexposed. The image is going to look almost white. You don't want that. And then you have the two issues previously. You have to overcrank your shutter speed, which you saw how that looked. It just looks, ugh. I mean, maybe you would want to do a 90-degree shutter or a 45-degree shutter for extra action. That's common for action movies. Or another common theme you'll see is using a 360-degree shutter, which looks like this. So you can see everything is super blurry, and it makes a very dreamy feel. Oftentimes it's used for romantic stuff, for romantic comedies and stuff, so you can see just how blurry everything is, and things just look extra romantic. Now you use a 360-degree shutter, which I personally hate, and I think it looks like poo. You dial in a 360-degree shutter, which in this case is a 1/25th of a second, ISO 100, f1.8, for nice B-roll or that shallow depth of field, which I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And everything's going to be really overexposed. And so you're going to have to really put on that ND filter and tighten her down. And I do not like the look of a 360-degree shutter. Much better. This looks so much better. Okay, that's why you need an ND filter. Very useful tool. The reason I went with the 24mm and not, say, a vlogger's 10 to 16mm, since I have an APS-C size sensor, or equivalent to a Super 35 sensor. Now I can simulate that, like let's just say this is Super 35. On a full frame camera, which is 36mm by 24mm, my field of view would probably, I'll angle this down a little bit, look something like this. And with that wider field of view, a lot of people say you get shallower depth of field. It does not. Cropping into the image does not change exposure or depth of field. However, the reason people say that is because with a full frame camera, I'd be back here. And I want a shot that looks like this. So I have to move the camera closer, and I'll move it closer so you can see the more subject separation from the background, therefore a shallower depth of field. Or alternatively, I'll throw on a tighter lens. I'm still keeping my 2.8, but you can see much more subject separation here. And also you get different perspectives when you change lenses, and different compression ratios and all that. But since I'm on the 50mm, but now you can really see the subject separation on the simulated full frame camera, because that 24mm was just too wide. And so I had to throw on a tighter lens, therefore giving me more background compression, therefore giving me a shallower depth of field with my given aperture. Hence why people say larger sensors give a shallower depth of field. That being said, full frame stuff gets a lot more expensive, and generally they have better low light performance. There's a whole mess of other different benefits from full frame to APS-C. However, in the cinema world, Super 35 is the norm, because in the film cameras, there was called a 35mm film, which was 35mm across here. Now the actual image that would be projected by said lens or on the film measure 36 millimeters by 24 millimeters, and that is what we use in the modern cameras today. Super 35 the film was fed in vertically. Now I'm being filmed vertically, hence filming in Super 35 mode essentially. Now if you notice, the image, well, because this is vertical I can do that, but the crop will be about here, hence a smaller sensor, and then therein lies the problem with a smaller sensor. You need to back up in order to match that full frame look. Now the reason we fed in vertically and not horizontally is because you can fit more images vertically. You see, because you can feed in about almost 3 Super 35 images on one full frame image. So you can see the inherent differences. I can fit almost 3 Super 35 images on one full frame sensor. I know this isn't full frame. Yeah, this was supposed to be a gear review and I dove into sensor sizes. I'm a nerd, I know. But hey, you guys choose to watch my videos. I still haven't figured out why, but you know what? That doesn't mean I'm not going to try and up the video quality for you guys. I want to stand up closer to the microphone, which with a 50 millimeter, that's what the field of view is going to be. A bit tight and a bit dramatic, but wow, look at the subject separation. Yes. So I'm going to throw on the 24 millimeter lens on there. There you go. Very shallow depth of field. A 50 millimeter f1.8 is a very common lens used for B-roll. And look at that. Just look how good that looks. Oh my goodness. I love the look of this lens. You just can't go wrong with it. Sorry, got carried away. Switching lenses again. So here I am back on the 24 millimeter. You can see the difference in subject separation. I was also using a wider open aperture, but I kept it at 2.8 on the 50 millimeter for the beginning of it. That is the main differences in sensor sizes. However, there is one more thing that I normally do for filmmaking, and right now I have the camera set to a landscape color profile, which is my personal favorite color profile to use. What is color profile, you ask? I have to stop and start recording, but I'll do it for you guys anyway. So this is landscape. This is standard picture profile. This is portrait picture style. And this is primarily used for portraits to get people's skin tones right. I'm not too big of a fan of it. I mean, look at my skin. My face just turns all orange. It just doesn't look good. Whereas landscape just looks nice and pretty. I'm keeping the same video settings to avoid changing other stuff, and I have the same lighting scenario. So that's all remaining consistent. This is the fine detail color profile. This one is what you would use for, say, food photography or fashion photography, where you want to capture all the little details of the subject's clothing, or you're taking pictures of, say, the text of a book for use of turning into a PDF. I don't know, maybe they scan it. The point is it's used for much finer detail, such as macro photography, taking pictures of patterns or more. You get the idea. There's going to be a little bit more sharpening, a little bit more saturation, a little bit more luminance. It's going to have a little bit more boosted of everything to get you a much finer detail shot, and your noise is probably going to be a little bit lower because it probably runs a higher denoiser on it. But at ISO 3200, I'm only looking at this with the small camera screen, but so far it looks like it's pretty clean. This is neutral color profile. Now, I've been shooting all these clips in 8-bit because I have not been able to film in anything higher. Now, what's 8-bit, you may ask? 8-bit refers to the color depth. So digital images are comprised of red, green, and blue subpixels for each individual pixel. every image is a mosaic of pixels. In this case, it's 1,920 by 1,080 pixels. And each pixel has 3 subpixels with a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. You can replicate every color possible by mixing the 2 colors. Now, in the analog sense, it can be, we'll just say 9.2 in green, 8.3857 in yellow, red, and blue, it could be 10.587653 for that value. So it can be anywhere between 0 and 256, 0 being, 0 bottoming out black, or 256 being white. If I were to be shooting in 10-bit, or 0 and 1s, think of 2 to the power of 8 for 8-bit, and that's 256. 2 to the power of 10, which is 1024. And that would be 10-bit, which would mean I have 4 times the amount of color values, actually 12 times because it's 3 different channels. So 8-bit has around 14 million colors, 10-bit has around 100 million colors, 12-bit has around 1.2 billion different colors. So 12-bit has 4,080, something like that. No, it would be 5,020. Around between 4,000 and 6,000 different colors per color channel. 14-bit is 16,000 different color values. This camera has 14-bit pictures, so it has around 14,000 different colors per channel, which equates to around 12 or 13 billion different possible color combinations, which is a lot. And then the next step up, which is 16-bit, and we have the technology to go past 16-bit, but we don't because our eyes only see in 16-bit color. So in 16-bit, it's 64,000 color values per channel. So 64,000 to the power of 3. And you get roughly, don't know if I got the number right, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 trillion colors. Could be wrong. I think it was 4.4 trillion, 299 billion, 99 million, 400 and something different color values. But the point is, the number is probably not right, but it's a lot of colors. And that leads to a different color style, which I believe I have next. Sorry, not next, but this is faithful. Not sure what this means. I'm pretty, according to the description, it keeps the colors faithful to their true look in reality. I haven't really noticed much of a difference in the colors space here, but for video, I usually don't shoot in the standard quote unquote color profiles, mostly because I want to be given the chance of being able to do it later in post. There are 2 more after this, and I'll show you what those are. This is monochrome, which I don't really use monochrome all that much. I mean, if I want to do something black and white, I can do it later in post. So I really don't shoot in black and white color in video that much, although the nice thing about black and white, if I crank up the ISO, so to something like 25,600, and we'll just drop the aperture, you can see how the grain that was present before just kind of like almost gives it a filmic look. So you can actually add grain to it, and with black and white photos, autofocus struggles because I'm at f7.1. So autofocus is struggling a little bit, but I mean dual pixel autofocus, it's keeping up just fine. That's fine. Anyway, so the grain actually turns into a more pretty pattern. What is going on with my autofocus? That would be the benefit of shooting in black and white, is you can actually get away with higher ISOs because instead of the red, green, and blue noise that looks so bad, you can see how the noise just looks so black, just disgusting noise. Generally, you want to avoid noise, but you can actually use noise in black and white photos, and it can actually look really good and used to portray a really rustic and unique feel to the image that you just couldn't really do at a lower ISO. So sometimes you want to raise that ISO, and if you want to do that effect in broad daylight, you are absolutely going to need a ND filter, preferably a variable one. Mine goes from 1 to 9 stops. And a stop of light is cutting the light or duplicating the light by a factor of 2. So if I'm 1 stop underexposed, I'm letting in about half the light that I should. If I'm a stop overexposed, I'm letting in twice the amount of light that I'm supposed to be. This is the color profile that I prefer to shoot in whenever I am allowed to, and that's called a log color profile. This is a weaker log version, but with log you get better dynamic range, and with this I can choose what I want my footage to look like in post. So I can make it look kind of dark and moody, or I can make it look super bright and colorful and super vibrant. I can keep the colors kind of muted down for a more grim kind of feeling. I can change the background to make it look all pretty or super ugly. I can add a whole bunch of grain. I get a lot of flexibility in post because I'm not able to shoot video in RAW, which in RAW doesn't matter, because in RAW the camera is not burning anything into the image, so not very many things are finalized except for your aperture and your motion blur. It's not really finalized in post. Your ISO and your white balance can be changed after the fact, and also your colors can be changed after the fact as well, because it's not really burning the colors in place. That's why you shoot in log, because when you're not shooting RAW and you shoot log, this is what is burned into the image. And so you can push those colors back and forth, and it's a lot easier to tone these colors down than these colors down. So that's really the main reason why I want to shoot log. And if you have too much log in an 8-bit codec, you'll run into banding issues. And what banding is that there's not enough color depth in the image, so you'll see a lot of stripes. I'll try and find an image that has a lot of banding to show you. But if you think of high-end cinema movies that are shot with Arri Alexas that shoot 16-bit RAW, you'll see no banding, and the colors will look as if you were there, or even better because it's a cinema camera. Versus 8-bit, you'll probably see a lot of banding because it's missing a lot of colors that you would normally see, and just tossing them out because it doesn't have enough room in the codec. The codec is the recording stuff, so the data rate, in other words. Gosh, I was talking about my gear at first, and now I'm talking about camera specs and geeking out. This is probably going to be a longer video. And I'm still shooting log, but the other issue I have with log, that's where I was going with. The other issue with log is when you raise up the ISO, because you're shooting everything flat, and you stretch the image back out, to stretch the colors back out, that also tends to bring out a lot of the noise. So at ISO 3200, whereas I can still get a pretty clean image, right now, when I stretch it back out, there'll be a lot more noise and things will look a lot less clear. Once I hit ISO about 800 or above, that's when I usually switch out of log, so that way I can get the best noise performance, or noiseless performance I should say, out of my camera. Because after about ISO 800, that's when noise starts creeping in. Okay, I really need to stop ranting to this camera. I need to finish feeding the animals, and I haven't fed the goats yet. They're mad, so you've probably been hearing them. I gotta go feed. Thanks for watching Goat Ranch. I'll see you next time. Really will. See ya.